To you right up front that during the course of the week there's going to be a few times, I think we're going to have some times that are going to be a lot of fun, but there's going to be a few times that are going to be pretty heavy, and I already know that. So how do you start a week out like this? How do I get to know you? I know some of you, but for many of you I'm a new face. For some of you my testimony is old hat, but for many of you it's new. And having prayed about it, I decided that what I wanted to do today, instead of anything particularly formal or an outline, was simply to share with you my testimony. For you see, young people, I am not here to push a doctrine or a denomination or a movement. I'm here to share Jesus because I love him very, very much. I have good reason to. See, when I was born, when I said that I could empathize with those young people, I can. For you see, I'm mentally retarded. Don't laugh. Oh, you say, I'm not laughing, Brother Barr. I'd already picked that up. Okay. I have a stack of report cards about that high that will verify that. I don't mean just that the grades are poor, but the teacher has written in down at the bottom, this little boy cannot learn. He's a good little boy. If you'll put him over in the corner and give him something to color, he'll behave himself and you can teach the students that will learn. I was 21 years old when I graduated from high school. I was born into a family. My mother had serious problems, physical problems. She had 12 children. Only 4 of us survived infancy. We would be born very premature. We would struggle for life for 10 days, 2 weeks, sometimes a month, and then pass away. When I was born, I was a blue baby. In those days, you had to have an immediate transfusion from that, and so I had the transfusion. From the transfusion, I got hepatitis. I was born with one leg much shorter than the other. I wore a weighted shoe for many, many years. Later, they would discover in x-rays that I have all kinds of bones. I just have bones floating around inside of me. Don't even hook up to anything. I was supposed to have been twins. That explains a lot. But But also, when we started off to school, it was discovered that I have dyslexia. Now, maybe you know what dyslexia is. It's not an IQ problem, but it is a perceptual problem. And it makes it very difficult, depending on how severe your case is. It can be impossible for you to learn such simple things as your ABCs. In fact, when I taught here all these years, I don't know if you still do it, but make them let you do it if they don't. Once a year, the students put on a skit in which they imitated their teachers. And whoever up here was imitating Mr. Barr would invariably come in with a pillow stuck in their shirt. I don't know what that was all about. But then, and they would reach in their pocket and pull out maybe in their case, a little stuffed animal, because I was famous for coming to school here with a bird or an armadillo or a squirrel or a black snake or something in my pocket and sharing it with the young people. In fact, I one time brought in not a mongoose, a vanilla, was a ferret. There we go. And put on a little demonstration up here on this very platform with my ferret and a bird. I'll tell you about that maybe later this week. But it was bloody. Okay. But they would do that. And then whoever was standing up here pretending they were Mr. Barr, you know how you're supposed to imitate those mannerisms that you pick up from the teacher? Well, whoever imitated me would imitate a mannerism that I apparently have, in which I, from time to time, slide my sleeves up and down. Finally, one day, a student came to me and said, Mr. Barr, why do you do that? And so I told him, you see, having the problems that I have, when I went off to school and I discovered I couldn't learn like the other students did, I just kind of retreated into a fantasy world. For one thing, I developed a serious speech impediment from the emotional trauma of being different. I eventually reached the point that I could hardly communicate at all. Stammered and stuttered horribly. And students just make fun of you. Shouldn't happen in a Christian school, by the way, young people. But I didn't go to a Christian school. And the students would make fun of you because you couldn't speak and because you couldn't learn. And even adults feel a little awkward around a little boy who can't learn and can't speak. And as a consequence, I developed serious emotional problems. I reached the point that I hated people with a passion. All people. People hurt you. I loved animals. I wanted to live in the woods with the animals. Animals were nice. People were bad. I'd often run away from home to go live with the animals. I was headed for the bug house, no question about it. During that time, I withdrew from the real world and I lived in a fantasy world. Most of my childhood is a blank to me. Most of it I do not remember. I have lived in every state in the United States except Alaska. My father was a career military officer. He would go to an air base for 3 months, instruct the navigators in the latest techniques and equipment, and then we'd move to another base. And so as a consequence, I've lived everywhere. And when you change schools in 3 different states each year, and then you make a career out of getting through school, you can build up quite a stack of report cards and yearbooks. My mother every now and then will get all these yearbooks out and go through them, and she'll say, now this is Tommy. Tommy was your friend when you lived in Waco, Texas. You remember Tommy? No, I don't remember Tommy. Oh, Tommy was your best friend. I don't remember any of this stuff. I just kind of lived in a fantasy world. We were living in Puerto Rico, in fact. I would have been about 8 years old, and we had a television, and on that television they had Batman even back then. And you know, Batman dressed up like a bat, flew all over the place. And so I found my father's oxygen mask that he plugged into the oxygen supply in the airplane. And so I put that on and tied a towel around my neck, and I became Elephant Man. And I would fly around the yard, Elephant Man. Well, it became so real to me that I decided that indeed I could fly. I climbed on top of a 2-story building and jumped off. And I discovered that I indeed was Elephant Man, that I flew very much like an elephant. And so down I came and landed in a cement bucket and shattered my right arm. I don't mean broke it, I mean shattered it like a piece of glass, 100 pieces. They flew me across the island to San Juan, Puerto Rico, where a doctor kept me for several months in the hospital, and he went back in repeated surgeries and put my elbow back together piece by piece. As a consequence, I have a lovely scar on my right arm. And I know just as a matter of fact that it is my right arm that has the scar. Well, every now and then I'd be up teaching the school, and I'd suddenly realize that I do not know a B from a D from a P, and I do not know my right arm from my left. You can always spot the dyslexic kids in the class. You go in and say, everybody raise your right arm. They go, oh, okay. Well, it's a little embarrassing if you're the teacher and suddenly you don't know which is right and which is left. And so I thought nobody'd notice, but I've developed a mannerism just every now and then of slide my sleeves up until I catch the sight of that scar, and then I know which is my right arm again, because I know that it's my right arm that I broke. So the kids always had a good time off of that. Had a lot of problems, but far more important and far more vicious than the problem of dyslexia was the simple fact that we did not know Christ. I was saved the first time I ever darkened the door of a church in my entire life. You know, it's been my privilege to be a missionary on a number of fields, do some mission work on a number of fields. I hardly qualify for being a missionary, but have done short-term work. And I have never met what we would call a heathen who knew less about Jesus than we knew. Some people think I'm exaggerating when I tell them that we lived in the United States and we did not know that there were different denominations. We didn't know that there were Methodists and Baptists and Holiness. We didn't know that. We just knew that some people went to church and some people didn't go to church, and we were among those that didn't. Now, there isn't anyone here that loves, adores their mother more than I do. I have a very wonderful, godly mama. If what I was about to tell you were still true, I wouldn't tell you, because I would not want to bring a reflection upon a mother that I love dearly and has been so wonderful to me. But back before she knew Jesus, my mother was wicked, not because she had a wicked heart, but because she didn't know. My mother was an alcoholic. She had joined the Alcoholics Anonymous trying to get help. They didn't help her. They do help some people with that problem. They didn't help her. She was a chain smoker, and while I blush to say it, I do want you to get the picture. My mother was a professional striptease dancer. Very lewd act. Wicked. Now, I do want to say this. I had a lot of problems in my life, but I did have one thing going for me that an awful lot of people do not have. Even at our worst, I always knew that my mother and my father loved me. There were times when the law threatened to come in and take us away from our parents because the money went for booze instead of for food. But it wasn't because they didn't love us. It was because they were captive to a vicious habit. Several years ago, before my children started marrying off, I was holding a meeting in Stoneboro, Pennsylvania. And one day I got my oldest son, Alan, my oldest daughter, Cindy, loaded them up in our van, and I said, we're going for a ride this morning. And they looked at me. They've learned that their daddy can do strange things. And so we headed off across the country, out into the country from a little city called Meadville, Pennsylvania, out to a little crossroads called Denny's Corners. Turned right at Denny's Corners and pulled off to the side of the road beside a great big pond. Lily pads and cattails and ducks swimming. And the kids looked at me, what are we doing here? I said, get out. So they got out. And we stood along the road, looking out over the pond. They're looking at me, now what? I said, I want to tell you something about this pond. I said, you see this lovely pond? I said, this has not always been a pond. In fact, it's only filled up with water in the last few years. It used to be a gravel pit, very deep, where they excavated gravel for building and construction and roads. I said, way over there, across in that far side where those ducks are swimming, about 40 feet down, before the water stood here, many years ago, there was a little tent pitched down there in the bottom of the gravel pit. I mean an old Army surplus tent, no floor, just wood and canvas. And inside were two little cots made of wood and canvas from the Army, an orange crate with a kerosene lantern on it, and that was home to a family. Said it was very, very tough times for everybody, but it wasn't that tough. And I can remember the many times when people would stop up here on this road and point down into the gravel pit and laugh at the poor white trash that lived in the gravel pit. I said, children, that is the first home that I ever remember in my life. In the Pennsylvania winter time, when water would run in under the tent and freeze solid, this was my home. I would like to read for you as my testimony Psalms 40, verse 2. He brought me up also out of an horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and set my feet upon a rock, and established my goings. For you see, that was the first thing I remember. I remember the wickedness. I had a young person, the age of many of you in here, a young teenage girl, come to me some time ago. She was feeling sorry for herself. Mr. Barr, you don't know all of the things that we don't have because my parents have served the Lord all their lives. Their parents were full-time Christian workers. She'd come into my office belly aching and feeling sorry for herself. Said, we don't have fancy cars and a big boat and fancy clothes because my parents have served the Lord. And I said, young lady, you're right. You're right. There's just a lot of things you don't have because your parents have served the Lord. And I said, there are a lot of crying people out there today that wish they didn't have some of those things. You don't have the sad memories. You don't have the heartache and the pain. I said, young lady, what's the first thing you ever remember your mama teaching you? And she thought a little bit and decided that it was a little chorus about Jesus. I said, would you like to know the first thing I ever remember my mother teaching me? A little handicapped boy. My father would be posted overseas, TDY, for a few months at a time, and while he was gone, my mother would entertain men. Every now and then she would get hold of a man that was more than she bargained for, and she'd want to get rid of him. And so she taught her little handicapped boy a code that she could tap out on the wall beside her bed that adjoined my bedroom. And when I heard the code, I would get up and get the nickel off of the dresser and crawl out the window and go down to the corner phone and call home, so that the phone would ring at home and my mother could answer it and pretend it was my daddy coming home early and get rid of the man she didn't want. It's the first thing I ever remember my mama teaching me. He brought me out of a horrible pit. While we were living in Puerto Rico, my mother gave birth to a little girl. I had an older sister. She lived only a couple of months. I visited her gravesite not too long ago. But now this little girl was born so premature. No one gave her any hope of living. She was born in a primitive condition out in the countryside of Puerto Rico many years ago, in a little Puerto Rican hospital Her lungs collapsed at birth, and they put her into an old Army surplus oxygen tent, though no one expected her to live. And because she had to stay in the oxygen tent, and because no one expected her to live, and because they didn't have the facilities they have now, no one weighed her at birth because they simply weren't able. After she'd struggled for life for a few weeks and it became obvious that she was indeed going to live, they weighed her, and when they weighed her, she weighed 2 pounds and 1 ounce. Her name is Anita, and some of you may know Anita. Anita is a missionary in Taiwan today and served in the Bahamas and the Turks and Caicos Islands and sat where y'all have sat here at this school. But when she was struggling for her life, my mother, not knowing God at all, but wanting her little girl to live, cried out to the God she didn't know and said, "Oh God, if you'll let my little girl live," and she figured the worst thing that we did was that we didn't go to church. She said, "If you'll let my little girl live, I'll start going to church." And against all the odds, Anita lived. We were posted back to the United States. One day, we were living in a trailer park, and one day there was a knock at the door, and a lady invited us to church. And my mother said, "We don't go to church." And the woman left. But after she was gone, my mother looked down at her little baby, remembered her vow that she'd made to God just a few months before, was afraid that maybe God would take her up on her vow. And so when the lady came back the next week and once again invited us to church, and I am so very, very glad that she came back again. This time we said we would go, and so for the first time in my life, 9-year-old boy, first time ever, nearly the first time for my parents since they were just little tiny children once or twice, first time for me, we went to church. It was a great, big, modern, high steeple church, a church that, with a denomination that really you don't expect to hear a lot of gospel in. But the preacher preached a simple gospel message. He preached that we were all sinners, but that Jesus had died for us, and that if we'd come to Him, He'd save us. And that's the truth if the devil says it. And so at the end of the service, my mother and my father and myself, my little brother and little sister not old enough to understand, we went forward. They didn't have an altar. They took us to an inquiry room, read some scripture to us, asked us if we believed them. We said that we did, and Jesus saved us. Oh, you can't get saved that way, Brother Barr. You got to cry a little bit. No, you can get saved that way if you don't know any better. And if you haven't walked behind a bunch of light and played games with God, you can get saved that way. I remember so well the very next morning as I stood, a little skinny, handicapped boy, stood in the darkened kitchen of our house trailer long before dawn, my heart slamming away in my chest, waiting, listening, till I heard the sound I'd been listening for, the milk bottles moving around out on the porch as the milkman delivered our milk. I'd been waiting for him. And I threw the door open, and he jumped back and looked at me as I stood there, and I said, guess what? He said, what? I said, I'm saved. And I knew that it was. And young people, that's why I'm here today. That day I discovered that I was not a piece of garbage. I wasn't a mistake. That you aren't important because you're good looking or smart or talented or rich. You're important because God loved you so much He gave His Son to die for you. And it changed my life. It transformed me. The clouds began to lift off of my mind. It didn't happen all at once, but God began to give me meaning and purpose and significance and value. And I knew that He had a place for me. And that's what I'm here for. I want to share Jesus because I love Him and because He's done so much for me. I remember how God began to transform our home. God instantly delivered my mama from alcohol. I know that there are people just as well saved as my mama who struggle with those habits. I know that. But God, in His mercy and grace, just instantly delivered my mama, delivered her from tobacco. She quit her job. Later that week, the preacher came by to see these people who had signed a card. And had just gotten saved in his church. And my mother was just bubbling over how God had delivered her and saved her. And the preacher that had brought us to Jesus was horrified. He said, "Mrs. Barr," said, "the devil will make a fanatic out of you." He said, "I drink liquor. I smoke cigarettes." He said, now when he heard what her job was, even he agreed she should quit. But he said, you do know that that has nothing to do with your salvation. Said, now that you're a Christian, you could be on the stage performing your act and Jesus come back and you'd go right on to heaven. People, I'd never been to church in my life. We didn't know anything, but God the Holy Ghost will teach you some things if you listen to Him. We knew better than that. And God began to work in our lives. Overnight, our home went from hell to heaven. I'm glad for you young people that have Christian homes. I'm going to think that in a situation like this, it would be the majority of you. It's a wonderful, marvelous benefit. But oh, it's so easy to take it for granted. I know both sides. And oh, I'll tell you, it is no wonder that I love Jesus. We're going to talk this week about some of those very things. About your parents. About their needs, and not just yours. But my mom and daddy became saints, and I loved them. And my life transformed and changed. I remember I went through those years of dating. In fact, when I was courting the woman who's now my wife, my daddy had a 55 Packard Patrician. And I would drive out there to the country, to the farm where my wife lived, and that great big Packard. Any of you know Tim LeBeau? You know the singer, Tim LeBeau? How many of you know Tim? A couple years ago, Tim and my son Philip back there, and I'm so glad to have him in here with us today, and myself, we went to Florida and picked that very 55 Packard up and brought it back home. I'll have to tell you that story one of these days. That was an interesting trip. I won't tell it while my boy's in here, though. He's glaring at me. So I won't tell you about him floating around with all his clothes on in the swimming pool. I love you, buddy. I need 2 or 3 big guys that'll volunteer to escort me out of here after the service where he won't beat me up. All right. You know, when I finally got out of high school, here's the thing, young people. This is why I believe in Christian education. I've given most of my adult life to Christian education. This is why I'm thrilled to be here with you. Because, you see, after I got out of high school at the age of 21, I told somebody one time, I said, I was going to go on to the 5th grade, but I got drafted. But it wasn't really quite that bad. But when I finally got out of high school at the age of 21, I was through with school. I just felt glad to ever just get out of high school. I never intended to go back to school. I guarantee you that. But I eventually married, and I was working as, in fact, I won't tell. I was just working. And God began to put His thumb in my back, as it were, that He wanted me to go back to college. I said, God, I don't want to go back to school. I was good to get out of high school. But He kept pressing, and so finally I realized that I would indeed grieve Him if I did not obey. And so and one thing I told Him, I said, Lord, because I felt like He wanted me to go to a secular college in the area and major in the life sciences, because I've always, I think from those days of hurt, but I've always loved living things. And so I said, Lord, if I go back and major in the life sciences, they're going to teach me evolution. And there must be a lot of good evidence for it because everybody believes it. And if they come trotting out all this evidence, I can't be like the proverbial ostrich and stick my head in the sand and pretend I don't see it. I have to face truth. I've got to be honest with myself. And if they convince me that evolution is true, my world will fall apart, because I've built my life on the conviction that the Bible is the inspired, inerrant, authoritative Word of God. Now, do you see what I was really saying? I didn't even realize it, but I was really saying I had doubts about the Bible, whether it could stand up to it or not. But I eventually realized God indeed intended me to go, and that I would miss His will if I didn't. And so I went back and enrolled in college. It was interesting. They had this big, long place with a little question up there on the application. Said, if you've been out of school for more than a year, what have you been doing in the meantime? I'd been out a long time. I guess they wanted an essay. I put growing up. And they accepted it. So back I went to school. So I remember I was in my first biology class, just a general biology class. Now I would have this same professor over the years for botany, for biochemistry, for anatomy, just a number of subjects, but this was just a general biology class. And I felt like a speckled bird to begin with because I was older than all the other students that were in there. And I was sitting there in the class, and the professor came out, and he just kind of opened this general biology text up and opened it to the introduction chapter, and he began to share with us just general introduction evidences for evolution. And I sit there and I listen to this evolutionary, humanistic, atheistic approach to things. And he began to pull down charts. He pulled down a chart over here, you know, that was the embryonic development of things. You know how the embryos develop. Had the stages in the development of the embryo of a fish and of a chicken and of a monkey and of a horse and of a man. And it pointed out the similarities. He said, you'll notice, for example, that all of these things, including you, begin life as one cell floating in a watery environment. That's because in your ancient ancestry you were one cell floating around in the primordial sea. He said, down here you'll notice that the human embryo has gill slits. And that's because you share an ancestry with the osteoichthyes, the bony fishes. He said, down here you'll notice that the human embryo has a tail. That's because you share a common ancestry with the apes. Now that's stupid in the very face of it. Apes don't have tails. Monkeys have tails, but not apes. Then he went over and he pulled down, you know, one of these charts of the different strata, you know, and the reconstruction of the fossils from several layers, the camel and the horse, you know, way down at the bottom, the little Eohippus dawn horse, and way up at the top, the modern Equus. Then he pulled down a chart of the vestigial organs. That's organs that used to do something when you crawled around on all four and ate grass, but now that you're up, you know, evolved to what you are, they don't do anything anymore. And he was going through these, especially when he was going through this one about the embryonic development of things. I was dumbfounded. I mean, I had read some, and I thought that was so thoroughly discredited that they didn't teach that anymore. And so I raised my hand. He looked at me and said, yes, sir. Well, I used the terminology that I had seen in the reading that I was doing, which, of course, was creationist reading, and I found that I was using a term that they don't use anymore. But I said, are you saying that embryology recapitulates paleontology? Well, as soon as I said that, he knew what I was, because they don't use those terms anymore. He glared at me. He came around and he sat down on the front of his desk and he just stared at me. And I could feel my ears turning red, and all the other students were staring at me. And finally he said, you're a creationist, aren't you? And I said, yes, sir. And he said, you know, he said, I don't know anything to call you but ignorant. You're just ignorant. Well, of course I was ignorant. What do you think I'd come to college for? Because I knew everything? We're all ignorant, just in different areas. You don't think I'm ignorant, ask me to bake a cake. You'll find out in a hurry how ignorant I am. But I knew that what the guy was actually telling those other students was that anyone who believed the Bible was ignorant. And so I went home, and I got down before God, and I said, God, I tried to tell you, and you wouldn't listen to me. You wouldn't pay a lick of attention, and now just exactly what I told you is going to happen's happened. And I said, the guy called me ignorant. He doesn't know. He hadn't seen my record. I'm not ignorant. I'm mentally retarded. I got a stack of reports. I'm worse than ignorant. And I said, here I am in this class, and all these students looking on, and now they know I'm a creationist, and he's done told them I'm an ignoramus, and they're going to discover I'm worse off than that. But you told me to go back, and I've done this to the very best of my knowledge at your bidding, and I'm in it now. And I already know that the best I can do is not going to be good enough. When I do everything I can do, it's not, you know my problems, you know my condition. And I said, Lord, I'm not asking you to drill a hole and pour in anything, because let me tell you right now, young people, he won't do it. But I said, Lord, if I do the best I can, if I study as hard as I can, even though I know it won't be good enough, would you somehow, for your honor and glory, would you come as I do my best, would you come and make up the difference and help me to demonstrate to these students and this professor that you do not have to be an ignoramus to believe the Bible. And I worked hard. I worked real hard. Year after year I worked hard. And God helped me. And young people, I say this, God knows my heart. I say this for His honor and glory. When I had taken my last exam under that professor, I walked out of the class and he followed me out into the hall. He kind of wanted to apologize, and he wasn't quite man enough to really do the job right. But he said, Mr. Barr, he said, I want you to know, you and I don't agree on a lot. That was an understatement. We'd had a running debate going for 4 years. He said, but I do want you to know, said, we're glad to have people like you in our school. And he said, I just thought you might like to know that you have the highest grade point average of any student I have ever taught. And I said, thank you, Jesus. You do not have to be an ignoramus to believe the Bible. And I know when you're hearing a Christian, that kind of a philosophy. So this coming week, I want to share things that I think will help us. I want you to get to know my heart, and I want to know yours. And I trust that you'll come even now with the purpose in your heart. I am going to come with my cup turned up. Now hear me as we close. That doesn't mean that you're going to agree with everything I say this week. Do you hear me? You may hear me say something that you don't agree with. That's fine. You may be right and me wrong. I'm not God. All I ask for and all I think any preacher has a right to is a fair hearing. But I think that anyone is playing the fool who doesn't come with an open heart and weigh what's said against the Bible and truth. And I believe if you'll do that, God can make this a good week for us. I'm looking forward to it. Would you stand with me? Anything else we're supposed to do before we dismiss? All right, you're dismissed. Have a good time. See you tomorrow.